I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. Season 12 is well on its way, and we have a very special guest with us today, Michael Kamil. He is the Emeritus Professor of Education at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, where his research has focused on literacy, reading acquisition, and the role of technology in education. His work examines how literacy develops, how beginning reading instruction can be improved, and how technology can be effectively integrated into literacy teaching. A central aim of his research is determining what kinds of instructional materials and technological supports best enhance early reading skills, and how to balance technological tools with the demands of literacy learning. He has also conducted extensive research on English language learners, including studies on how recreational reading of informational texts relates to their reading achievement. How are you doing today?
Well, after that, I feel almost exhausted at that list of specialties. Um, I'm doing very well. It's very pleasant out here in California, and we are not experiencing the kind of weather on the East Coast that I lived for a long time on the East Coast, so I know what that's like. But this is much nicer.
You have a preference in terms of
I don't think you could blast me out of California with dynamite.
I
Uh,
miss the seasons though. I do miss the fall
I
colors. I do miss seasons.
I will grant that. But what I don't miss about the seasons is having to get out and shovel the walk of all the snow and having to live through very hot summers.
Totally fair.
I was born in St. Louis and went to high school there as well. Um, and the summers in St. Louis were almost unbearable.
Is
And
it because it was so humid or
both hot
uh,
and humid. So sometimes it could be triple digit. Well, it can't ever be triple digit
dang.
humidity, but it could be 99% humidity and 99 degrees. Uh, that never happens here. This is not a place with a lot of humidity.
Yeah, I feel like, I was actually just talking to a friend recently and she was telling me in New York it went into the negative for temperature for for 2 weeks,
Oh,
I
oh
think.
yes,
And
yes.
I've never experienced negative temperature. So I was like, that's crazy.
Well, I lived for a time in northern Minnesota, and that was routine. It was. I remember visiting the campus there one time from Arizona. It was 100 degrees in Arizona. When I looked out the window of the plane and landed in Duluth, it was truly amazing because everybody was bundled up in ski jackets, and I had my sort of summer shirt on and jacket and the like. But
And so what did you do then? You just went to the nearest place and got some jackets?
no, I had packed suit coats
Oh, got it.
and I wasn't there for that long. But I still have clothes that I wouldn't wear here in California because just too much. But
Yeah.
from their place anyway.
Nice. Well, I'm super excited for today's conversation. I feel like we've been having a lot of, dialogue around literacy and really just thinking about putting kind of a gray area around understanding what actually is literacy. When we say that word, what are we talking about? And I feel like that is already just such an interesting place to begin because, and whenever we want to measure these things or put them on some sort of structure that we're able to be like, okay, level one, level two, level three. Sometimes it feels really arbitrary, especially with something as vast as literacy. So, first, I guess before we even begin, when we use that word, what are we exactly talking about?
Well, we're talking about communication in general, and we communicate in through literacy. And so there are the five communication skills. Thinking is the number one skill in all of that. Um, Reading, writing, listening, and um, presenting is a good enough word. So showing people a diagram or something is literacy. Most people working in literacy today are beginning to slowly recognize that electronic literacy is very different from conventional literacy in many, many regards. And in particular, the regards that you can show things in different ways that emphasize different characteristics among them. So of the 5 skills, thinking is clearly the most important. And the next most important by a long sight is reading, because there are lots of people who never write much, but have to read a lot. And so it's sort of a consensus among people in the field, except for writing researchers who won't agree to that. But in general, people believe that reading is the most important thing that students need to acquire, that people need to acquire to lead a productive life, because it really does mean that you have to do all that reading. Just go shopping, for example. You have to be able to read ingredients and labels and all that other stuff. But so that's the first thing. Now, what does that mean in principle? Because you can't do reading without somebody having done writing. And there is some research to show that if you are teaching reading, combining it with teaching writing is better than doing as 2 separate things. So that doesn't mean those others are unimportant. Talking for a long time, I think a lot of people would have argued that it's sort of unimportant, and listening is not as important, although podcasts sort of give the lie to all of that people do this and they listen, and here we are just presenting with speech. So they've come back. In the early part of the 20th century, there's a reading researcher named Edmund Huey, well respected, and he wrote a book called The Psychology of Reading. And what he predicted in 1908 was that one great way to have people communicate was through pictures, live pictures accompanied by speech. And so I think he was doing, early motion picture kinds of extrapolation, but I think he would have been amazed at how right he was today with podcasts and videos and all the like. And so that's it. Now, what are the skills? I don't know if you want me to get into a technical thing about the skills, but there are essentially 5 skills in reading that are important. And they're often called in the field the big 5. One is phonemic awareness, which is the ability to manipulate sounds in oral language. So if I tell you something begins with a B sound, you could come up with bag or bill or bet. If I tell you that, no, it's got to be a P, you could do pill or pet or whatever. So that is oral language. It's not text at all. But in order to learn to read, you have to be able to manipulate things orally. Second is phonics. Everybody's heard about that. We've had phonics wars for years, that people want to say that's the only way you can learn to read. Other people say you never need it at all. The research shows that at least at the very minimum, learning to do phonics makes you read better, faster. So it may not be the only way to teach it, but you can't do discovery. There's even a school of thought that says you don't have to teach things, you just let kids explore. Same kind of thing with phonics. Why should you bother exploring how to say the words from text instead? Then vocabulary is probably the next one on the list. And that's just, at the upper end of vocabulary, size of vocabulary, people know 100,000 words. That's probably college educated people who
Really?
Oh,
No
yeah.
way.
Yep.
No
Yeah.
way. Do you, I know, no, there's no way I know 100,000 words. That's
Oh,
so many.
I'll bet you know, I'll bet you know far more than you think you do. Because remember,
Wow.
there are all those words that have the same roots.
But
And
you're not counting like run, running, ran. Do those count?
oh yeah, that's all part of it. But
Okay.
the
Okay.
hundred thousand goes well beyond that. I mean that doesn't account for all that much. Um, Mostly tenses and verbs, and you can always add those in. But 100,000 words is sort of a well agreed upon level for highly educated, highly literate people. Um, More basically, to get along in the world, you probably need about 20 or 30,000 to get along well. And that's up for more debate than the upper limit is. And that's a kind of thing where people have to come with language and vocabulary in order to learn to read. So then they have to understand what they're reading. And I use that because I would yell at my students if they said that, because if you didn't understand, you weren't reading. You were just translating the words on the page into sound. And that's different because it doesn't give you any kind of meaningful outcome. And then the other part of this is fluency, that you have to be able to do this relatively automatically and quickly.
Mm.
So those are the big five. Um, and I hope that I didn't confuse you with all the other stuff there. Um,
Quick question. Quick question. Why does mnemonic awareness matter?
Phonemic awareness.
Phonemic, sorry, phonemic awareness. Why does that one
Okay.
matter?
Because it's the way that we break up words in oral speech and that we produce them. And so that helps to, when you learn phonics, you can use that to determine what part of the word you could kind of decode into speech. In other words, if you take bill and pill, those are two things. You've got to be able to know that those are different words that have different meanings.
And phonics is your ability to kind of just enunciate the word or
No,
properly say it.
is to translate the text on the page into oral speech,
Oh, got it. Okay, so
or
that's like the
eventually,
first step.
or eventually into mental speech.
Got it. Okay, that is so cool. I mean, I'm a huge fan of lists, and I feel like it just makes it structures a lot of this into simpler things because you can take something very complex like literacy and break it down into something that is much more manageable to actually work with. And so, I guess one question I have for you, and I feel like as I'm slowly navigating, I'm, about to be 30 soon, there's kind of like a disconnect between me now and what I would consider to be popular culture. Primarily also because I'm not on social media too much. And so a question I have about literacy is sometimes it feels so context dependent. So, for example, if I was to say, what's 9 plus 10? And if someone says 19, they're not referencing the joke that I had in mind that was this really popular Vine from, the 2010s. So, when you say what's 9 plus 10, someone says 21, and that's like a joke, right? But there are many things like that that actually don't necessarily fit perfectly into what is quote unquote right. But it is still a way of communicating. So when we think about literacy, should we be thinking about it as if there's like one right answer, or is it extremely context dependent and it's much more based on understanding?
Well, the answer to those two alternatives is yes. Um, and so two things can be true at once. You do need to come up, well, you need to interpret what's on the page. And that is trying to get at what the author was trying to say when he wrote that text on the page. And that's true for speech as well, is that you have to make an attempt to figure out what the person was trying to say as opposed to what you heard. And if those two don't match, you'd get miscommunication. So we have that um, uh, in all sorts of ways, and I won't even go into to all the ways that you could begin to get confused by that. But that's an important part of this, is that the act of comprehension, which is that ultimate goal of reading, is to be able to interpret what the text said and what it meant. And as you know, the old saying goes, many a slip between the lip and the cup. You don't always get it right. And especially because English isn't the most unambiguous language there is, that we have lots of double meanings. And your joke was a good example of a double meaning of that. And so that's the issue here, is it's not easily defined. But if we don't agree on that, we fail, both in education and in life. And you really have to make every effort to say that people are making this right. It's sort of like a contract. And there's a linguist named Grice who said this is sort of the contract, that you have to be able to match up what you think the author is saying and that it's rational. Now, it isn't always. And we have lots of examples of that in politicians, for example, that they'll say one thing and mean something else. That's very common today, especially as the argument. The point of that is, though, that that's a major kind of skill that people have. And if I could read you just a little piece of the definition, this is from the National Assessment. And the only reason I want to read this is because I often leave out some words that are important. This is for a 12th grade student, which is sort of the end of formal education for lots of individuals. So they need, if at the top level, the advanced level of reading, they should be able to analyze both the meaning and the form of the text and provide complete, explicit, and precise support from the text for their analyses with specific examples. In other words, here's why I said this is what this text meant. Here's the example of it. They should be able to read across multiple texts for a variety of purposes, analyzing and evaluating them individually and as a set. In other words, you ought to be able to create something from a bunch of disparate texts.
Got it. I mean, because you said you've worked with a lot of these standards and you've helped construct a lot of them. Was that for the country or was that for the state?
That was for the National Assessment. I was in charge of part of that for the government lets a contract, and then I was hired to be in charge of actually putting together the framework. And we had a big committee. It wasn't just, I wasn't doing it on my own. It was a huge committee. I've also worked on Common Core, which is sort of the latest iteration of standards that we have. And standards, the idea of standards is that we ought to be able to say that students learn to read in specific ways at specific times. The French in their educational system had a wonderful thing, and that is that what they did was write a text, and everybody in the country was supposed to be on the same page on the same day going through that text. Well, what we know now is that's not possible. There are speedy learners and less speedy learners. And so we don't keep to that kind of standard, but the idea is that over a period of time in first grade, you ought to learn something, and you ought to learn something that moves you along so that in second grade, you learn more. And that's the step idea, that you're accumulating all that knowledge. The problem with that is that it's not that clear cut, as you just said. It's sometimes you can do without some of those steps, but the steps are a guideline, so it can help teachers and students understand where they need to go from where they are. And so Common Core was a great idea as a national set of standards. This country has been opposed to national standards for such a long time. I have no idea how long that's been, but it's almost like it's a poison, and everybody wants to stay away from it. Besides that, education resides with the states for the most part, and not with the government, federal government. And so they want to control. So essentially, Common Core wasn't adopted by everybody. But if you look at the people who either adopted it and refused to continue with it, or who didn't adopt it and adopted other standards, they look very similar. So even though we don't have a single set of mandated standards, they all look pretty much the same. Not, and there are variations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be the first person we've had on the show who's worked directly with standards. So I have a lot of questions just about the process of how those are built. So so it's a group of people, 100, how many people are kind of working together on this?
Well, there were probably, I can't tell you exactly, but probably 40 people, maybe more, because we had other people come in and offer opinion. Plus, open comments when when we proposed a draft is,
Yeah. So I mean, so a question I have is what is the structure like? Do you first come up with thinking big picture? What by the end of 18 or whatever, the end of what are the things that we like ideally would like in relation to this particular subject? And then do you start backtracking? Okay, if this is the final goal, we start at 12th and then 11th and then 10th. You go down. So what is the steps?
well, that's one way. It's called backward mapping. And so you take what I read to you, if you want all students to be at the advanced level. And by the way, not all students are, only about 5% ever reach that advanced level on the national assessment. And then you figure out what you need to do to get to that point. What's the first thing you need to do? What's the last thing you need to do? And how do you fill that in? So a lot of this is teachers having that experience, a lot of researchers who've studied how students acquire literacy. All of that contributes to something that they say, here's an order, and it doesn't always have to be exactly like this, but early on, you've got to learn phonemic awareness. It takes about, maybe at on the average, about 40 hours of instruction in first grade, maybe.
Really?
Oh yeah, that's about it.
Oh,
That's all it takes, is to make sure, because a lot of kids already know that. Um, there's a wonderful study many years ago called Language in the Crib. It's by a woman named Ruth Weir. And she had a son who she started listening at night. And what she found out is he was practicing. And so he would go, Bill, pill, mill, fill, just to practice the words. And that was essentially phonemic awareness. Interestingly, he had to share a room several months after she discovered this with a guest, a kid. And he never did it. He never did the practice after that. So it was that he didn't either think it was appropriate, or the other kid told him to shut up or something, but he never did it afterwards. But it was so important that he would mimic the kinds of things that we do in learning, getting kids
yeah.
to practice that. So all of that contributes to knowing what we need for students to do. There are also,
So
go ahead.
Sorry, I just have so many questions. Sorry. I mean, this is truly fascinating. So, because I think what you're bringing up there is really fascinating because before a lot of students, especially with English, I think more so than math, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels that by the time someone turns 5 and goes to kindergarten, there's already such a wide range of home experiences from whether your parents are reading to you, whether they're actually talking to you, versus places where you may not have so much interaction. How do you then create standards where you're able to kind of fit all types to account for different
Uh,
backgrounds?
so nobody thinks that you can do what the French said you could do, that every day move one more page or something. But that means that you've got to have individualized instruction, so that some students will get the skill that you're trying to teach that day um, right away. Some might take 2 days to get it, and some might take even longer. And we do have a large number of kids who, almost take forever to get some of these things. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It just, they didn't get the idea. Um, but some of those skills uh, are really required. So to do phonics, you need to have phonemic awareness. In other words, if you can't separate words um, orally into their component sounds, you can't apply phonics, which is translating the letters into component sounds. So there's that notice that has to be taken of all of this as a curriculum, is that I think we stopped trying to write a prescriptive curriculum that says you will do this today and this tomorrow and this the day after. But these are the things that somewhere you've got to learn in order to get through to the end of literacy, which is sort of what I read to you a few minutes ago.
Yeah, and I think something you mentioned that was really interesting is you were saying at the advanced level, which is what I think is the thing that you read for the advanced level.
It is the advanced
Yeah,
level.
and you said only 5% doesn't reach that level.
Right.
I guess my question is, because these standards are just human made, does that mean that where we've drawn the line is actually far too? How do we know whether the
Uh,
problems is actually with schooling itself or if it's with the way we've defined what is advanced? What if our definition of advanced is too advanced?
well, that is sort of the problem. That was the impetus for Common Core as a set of standards, that they didn't think it was advanced enough. And so the setting those kinds of skills um, is done both statistically and philosophically. In other words, what do we want you to know about literacy? What level of literacy do we really want you to have? Now, maybe not everybody needs advanced literacy like that, but I think what we know is an important finding over the last decade or so, and that is that the skills in order to go to work or go to college are almost the same. And because of that, we can't say, oh, well, here's some easier stuff to do, unless we do that in the service of getting you up to the level that we think you need to exist in the real world, is as opposed to literacy needs. But it used to be that people said, well, I'm not going to college, so I don't need to read much. Well, yeah, but the skills are the same. Uh, I remember years ago going through a TSA line, and there weren't many people in line at that airport. And the woman checking was a student, and I guess she was filling in part time. The book that she had was the college text on biology. And I asked her where she was in college. She said, no, I'm in high school. So I have no idea, why she was there. But what I didn't understand is that her need for literacy, to understand biology, was the same as somebody going to college, and it wasn't any more or less rigorous. So this is confused, in a sense, and sometimes it is confused because people decide, well, it's just not. It's the question you asked. How do we know what that is? Well, we ask what's desirable. Once upon a time, signing your name was making an X. Very few people will accept that under very few circumstances anymore. But now we expect people to be able to write their name and sign a paper. And we expect them to be able to read instructions. And so that's the kind of thing. There's a lot of studies about what are the occupational needs in literacy. In other words, what does a welder have to be able to read to do his job? Well, he's got to read a lot of chemistry and physics about how things, melting points, interactions of different metals, and so on. And those are all written in manuals. And those manuals then determine what the level of literacy you need to be a welder. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm sort of, I think that's the reason why we have standards, and then we don't have prescriptive ways to teach them.
Yeah, I guess maybe from a personal anecdote that I feel relates to this in some ways is like I didn't really read growing up, and I had a huge kind of aversion towards English language arts. I really didn't do well in school in a lot of ways, particularly in English. And I feel like in any of these standards, I would have been probably somewhere in the middle. And it was only when fell into a philosophy class for the first time, which then opened my eyes to poetry, which then
Uh,
opened my eyes to the beauty of words and vocab. All of a sudden, something that felt so mundane to me my whole life became the most fascinating thing ever. And so then I started reading all the time, and I mean, I don't think 10 years ago, if you were to tell me that I would be reading poetry on a regular basis or writing it, I would have ever thought that would be the world that I was living in. But I guess in some ways, these standards sometimes feel like they're stuck in some ways where it's like if you're at this level, then I just feel like the piece that gets missed, and I would just wonder if it's possible to create standards with this in place, is a true love of the thing itself. Because I feel like so much of it is just based on like how competent are you at this very moment, which means someone could leave at 18-year-olds pretty competent at something, but they could spend doing that same thing for the rest of their life, like never again. So let's say you leave at 18 relatively competent at math, but then you never look at a math textbook, you don't even really apply it. Your skills will naturally just decline. By the time you're 30 or 40, you won't remember anything you did in high school. And so I feel like standards isn't enough in some ways because it doesn't measure how long will you continue interacting and learning the thing that you did until you were 18.
I see what you're expressing is sort of the philosophy behind Common Core.
Hmm.
So if I can tell you, I think I can do this from memory without reading it. Um, there are about 10 or 12 skill areas. The first is you need to be prepared for college or work. You know, one way or another. That's the way the world divides up. So that's one. You need to become independent in literacy. You can't always go to somebody and ask, what should I do here? Um, you have to be able to build content knowledge. In other words, if you're the welder, you need to learn how to put two different kinds of metals together, for example. Um, you need to understand that texts are written for different audiences, for different tasks, and for different disciplines. And those are all unique forms that you need to do. Um, you need to comprehend what you read and critique it, which is part of that advanced level. But even at the basic levels, that's also true. It's just a different standard of what counts to meet that. Um, you need to privilege evidence. I always feel bad about saying that out in public because these days, I mean, you look at videos on TV and people are asking you not to believe what you just saw. And that's a key of literacy is that you have to privilege evidence over what somebody tells you. Um, you need to care about precision. And again, the more literate you are, the more precise you're going to be, or that you should be. Um, and then here's the thing that relates to your little anecdote is you need to look at craft, sort of art and craft of text. And so you're saying suddenly you looked at poetry and you saw the art and craft of it, and that made a difference to you. Well, that's what you got to be able to do. You need to be able to use technology strategically and capably. And that means that sometimes you need a video, sometimes you need a computer program, sometimes you need a book, sometimes you don't need anything except verbal instructions, all of that. And then they added in the philosophy is that you need to be able to understand other cultures and perspectives. And so if you can do all of those things, you're literate at some level. The more of those that you can do and the better you can do them, the more literate you will be. And
Yeah. I mean,
that's why I started with that advanced kind of thing. That's a goal to kind of get to, even if only 5% of the students ever make that.
one, very impressive that you had all of that off the top of your head. And I
Well,
feel like,
that's what you get for working with it for a long time.
yeah, I mean, okay, so I feel like you mentioned earlier about how nationally we've always kind of held this anti-standards kind of belief. But when you list out the kind of things that you just mentioned right here, from a layman's perspective, it feels for me very like honorable, not in the sense of even putting the effort to kind of like think about what are the core aspects of literacy or communication that we value. And then putting together something like this to then give it structure and shape is a difficult task. And it'll never be perfect, but you keep aiming towards it. But I'm curious because I think a lot of the sentiment against standards is also very valid. So, how do you feel? Because I guess a quick little tangent on this particular point, though, is I'm realizing now the challenges happen that when you think about education from a very structural, national or state level, you're kind of forced to think about things through these standards, through these kind of generalizations that you can then enforce across 5,000, 6,000 miles of land for millions and millions of students. But at the classroom level, when you're literally interacting with real humans, individual humans, these standards seem so separate from like real life.
Because they're standards, they're not instructional prescriptions. In other words, the standards don't tell you how to teach this. It
Hmm.
says that you got to get the students to be able to do these things.
And is that one of the challenge? Is that one of the maybe the tensions that's not, you get all these standards, you see these big lofty goals, but then you don't actually know how to make that happen. Is that one of the maybe disconnects?
That's why professional development was a big part of the Common Core push. Is that there had to be a lot of professional development to help teachers understand how to teach these and how to make the kinds of decisions in the classrooms that you're describing. Because even in a classroom, you'll have, of 20 kids, you might have, you know, 15 different ability levels. And so you got to do that. And then you got to make decisions about what you could put together so that it didn't hurt. Because sometimes putting a high achieving student with a low achieving student actually helps both of them. It helps the high achiever organize better what he already knows or she, and the lower one then has models to work with that it can actually emulate. So you're right. That's a big thing. But the standards don't impose ways of teaching. They impose ideas behind what you teach.
Yeah.
So
And so
those things that I listed for you, for example, uh, being prepared for college or work requires required a big shift in reading instruction because even today, I suspect a lot of people go into teaching reading as a career, believing that it's literature. And that's not what it is. It's preparation for reading, either for college or work. Now, that means you got to teach a lot about information, how to read information. And we didn't have that. In fact, that's been a long-term aspect of my research, is how to get people to understand that understanding information is very different from reading literature. That decoding the words is very similar, but if you look at stuff that are in the reading instruction programs, very often the text is just horrible. It's oversimplified, and it's not interesting to the students, or it's so decontextualized that it makes no difference. And very rarely did you ever have students put together two or three things that they read to come up with a conclusion or a critique. So all of those things, we don't tell people how to do that. I would have ideas on all those things. And when I go out to do professional development, I will tell teachers what I think they should do, but it doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it.
I guess I've just been thinking a lot about why some part of this feels like, my experience, I guess the part that's missing about all of this is the why behind all of it. Like, what, like, none of this really focuses on why any of this matters, like, from a student's perspective. Like, if I'm 10 years old and I know that I need to learn how to privilege evidence, but I'm like, but why?
Uh, so one way of approaching that, and I'm not saying it's the only way, but one way is called project-based learning.
Hmm.
You want to know how to fix your bike? Here's what you have
Yeah,
to do.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Want to know how to get governments to stop polluting the atmosphere? What do you got to do?
yeah.
You got to find evidence. You got to be able to read. You got to be able to synthesize. You got to be able to do all those things. Now, remember, I didn't say that's the only thing, because art and craft and structure, that means you got to do an appreciation of literature. And I probably read more literature and literary commentary these days than anything else. But it's important, because it's not only entertainment, but it allows you to live in worlds that you don't want to experience.
Mm.
In
It,
other words,
I think
go ahead.
I think no, I think that totally makes sense. And I was going to add, would you say maybe introspection is also something that could possibly be added to this list?
I think it is in all of these things. In other words, independence, you can't do that without introspection. Um, Content knowledge, you can't build it without knowing what you already know. Um, Comprehension and critique, I think I said earlier, critique requires introspection. What do I know that I can say that is wrong here or is right here? And critique doesn't always mean something's wrong. It means just privileging evidence. What do I know that would allow me to make this decision? Introspection. Now, maybe in some sense, um, I think I could go through that whole list now that I stopped to reflect on it and show you where introspection is seated there. But maybe it should have been broken out. It's um, there's a term that's used in sort of in this called metacognition,
Yeah.
and it's an important issue in education or in life or whatever. But it's knowing what you know, and that's a different way of saying introspection.
Yeah.
And there's a whole literature on that, and it is important in how to teach.
Mm.
But
I mean, this is just all really interesting to me. And in working with standards, what have you seen to kind of be the challenges in building these type of, like,
uh,
you talked about 40 people coming together. It must be really hard to even get on the same page for some of these things, right?
well, sometimes I don't think I'm giving away any trade secrets here or any confidential information, but we had a member on one of the committees that I worked on at one time who believed that the only thing we should be talking about was literature. And she was just very disruptive. And that is a problem. But in fact, you got 40 other people that you can address and you make compromises. Then you've got open comments from the public. You're invited to look at this and make any kind of comments they want and do revisions based on that. And then you've got trials of these things. Can they be used by teachers? See, we can make up stuff that teachers could never do, even if we thought it was good. That's got to be part of this too. So there are compromises in that regard. Um, I don't, I'm not sure what else I could say about that, but I understand what you're asking. I just find that as you break these down and do that, I should send you a copy of these things, at least a sample of some of the standards. These are not the standards, these are the philosophical groupings of the standards.
Mm.
And I'll try and remember to send that to you.
I've never looked at standards before, but I would like I need to. I have not though.
If you're
Because
going to do literacy work, it's probably the single thing that both unites and disunites people studying literacy.
it's really interesting because I think from like you get to put all of these together and you have some sort of consensus. Do you need to rank or order these values?
Um, the ones that I do because I've said them out loud so often. I do that almost in the order that they're presented as the framework in Common Core. Um, I wouldn't rank them that way. I would start by um, privileging evidence as the
As
number.
number one, huh? Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
that for me that's. But then I'm a researcher, and I believe in information, and I think that's what really upsets me about a lot of uh, government policy is it doesn't privilege evidence. And we've seen that. We've seen that about vaccines recently. We've seen that about nutrition. We've seen it about vaccination. Um, and it doesn't seem to matter that there's no evidence for what people say. And I think our children's education is too valuable to be tinkering around without evidence.
Yeah, and I feel like that probably sinks a lot into that's probably one of the biggest overlaps with both science and math standards as well, the privileging of evidence, because I feel like it falls heavily in both of those fields as well.
Yeah, the math at the same time we were doing uh, language arts things, they were doing math things in another part of the building.
So cool.
And the math people seemed to reach agreement very readily, although there were arguments later. But in math, there's at least a whole bunch of stuff that's a clear answer. If you want to know whether you can do the integral of, X, Y, or Z, um, you got to be able to come up with the right answer because if you don't, it's not going to work. That's not necessarily true with a lot of reading. Is that some of it's opinion, some of it's um, indeterminate, some of it's only partly right. Uh, and given that, I agree with you. I mean, we can't hold to a strict standard, but we can try and decompose this into things that are teachable. And as I said, we do think what the normal progress should be. That doesn't mean all students meet that. We may need remediation, we may need acceleration, we may need all kinds of other things. And there are things missing from the Common Core. And that's particularly about electronic literacy. It says that we ought to use technology, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how to go about approaching it.
And I feel like another one that seems to be missing is also like calligraphy aspects of it, like the actual beauty of the writing it's like your physical writing, or would
Uh,
that fall?
remember, these are really for reading.
Oh, all of these are for reading. Got it.
Yeah, this is the reading things. Um, the writing things now, teaching writing with reading makes it better for both. But for a lot of languages, calligraphy isn't that important.
Hmm.
Like in English, it's nice, and we do some of that. If we want to emphasize a word, we put it in bold or something, and you know, but that's not as common a thing. But I think you're right, particularly in say Farsi or Hindi or something like that, that there's a beauty to things on the page.
Hmm. I mean, it could be. I mean, I feel like I love English letters too. I feel like I really enjoy writing in cursive. For me, that makes, even as I take my notes, I write it all in cursive and it makes me very happy to look at it. But I know now a lot of schools they're no longer teaching cursive, which makes sense in some ways, but in other ways it seems sad.
Well, I never liked cursive instruction. It was just, I don't know if you learned the Palmer method of making O's repeatedly across a line so that you didn't dip below the line and you didn't go above the line ahead. Uh, and it's, I didn't like that at all. And so my penmanship was never very good. And maybe that's why I didn't like it either. But we never had standards for that. I guess we did for some of the methods, but never, we didn't have people agreeing on it very well. Um, but I see what you're saying, and you look at somebody like Ogden Nash who can make a poem beautiful just by the way it's displayed on the page. Um, there are all sorts of things like that, you know. And then there are people who do egregious things with displaying text on the page. Um, I'm reading a book right now that I didn't think I was going to like, but I decided to try this. It's called um, "Is Homer Still Relevant?" And it turns out to be just filled with archaeological evidence about whether Homer was a real person or a group of persons, where the Greeks came from, how Greek concepts are represented in other languages and the like. Well, it's a slog to get through. It's not bedtime reading. It's got to be alert and process. And I think that's another part of the thing. I want to add this thing is that education at the elementary level in schools tends to be oriented around entertainment. Did kids like it? Or play? Now, play has for a long time was not part of instruction, but it's making a comeback as these things always do. Um, and I think you could do play the way we do computer games, some computer games, that there's something you want to learn. And if you learn it as playing a game, like how to solve problems, for example, that's useful. But if it's play for play's sake, you're wasting kids' time and they don't have that much time to learn what they need to go on in life.
Do you feel that way?
Yes.
You feel like the 12 years is not enough?
It is if we do it right, but if we waste a lot of that 12 years in doing things that aren't working, then we're cheating the students.
Hmm. Yeah. I guess one thing that's interesting, and I'm curious, we can kind of start wrapping up, but when we think about the ways in which education could be improved, it is still fascinating that we're able to kind of still carry out a really advanced economy with what we have now, right?
Yes. Um, the problem is that we don't know about the details of that. We don't know how much better the economy could be if more people could read at that advanced level and enjoy life better. The Europeans do a much better job when in things like this um, assessment, international assessment called PISA, PISA. And the idea of PISA is that literally should augment your life. In other words, it should make your life richer and better. And we don't have that here. We have that, I read you the definition that we use in this country, in a sense, to measure that. So there are places where this is done differently and where they ask different questions and where they teach differently.
Yeah.
And,
I,
you
I
know,
get, but I guess to me, what that feels like though is in these standards, what would need to be added is let's say we both read a sentence. You understand the sentence great and you understand how it relates to society and you can really analyze the sentence and do all of these other things. But let's say I read that sentence and I'm not able to do all the things you do, but I have a great time reading it. I feel a lot of joy. I feel, right? Like, I mean, if what we're measuring is that, then none of this even talks about
Right.
that.
The problem is that a lot of learning is hard work. It's not all enjoyable. And yet the goal is to make it easier to read and understand. And then you have extra mental capacity that's left over to consider things like the aesthetics of it. But it's in here. It says art and craft of structure.
But that's just like one kind, it feels like one throw, like kind of like just, but I feel like the appreciation of the internal experience of reading, like not just the appreciation, but like the actual internal mechanism of how I feel when I relate to something should be 50% of the things that matter. Like that is its own, like to develop that requires its own level
It,
of as depth as the technical skills.
it might well be. And there are a lot of English language arts teachers who will teach only that, and leave students without being able to understand information efficiently.
Hmm.
And so we got to make a choice. Well, the choice that I'm going to make is that I want both, but if I have to sacrifice some of that art and craft, I want to make sure that they privilege evidence and that they can synthesize and come up with new information.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. And I feel like that's like you'll always have, I feel like the pendulum will always swing in both directions.
It needs. I fully believe that reading for pleasure and reading for uh, uh, what you can learn from literature is truly important. But aside from a few literary literature editors and literary critics, there's not much call for that skill in life, if you want to support yourself. See, I'm worried about whether or not people can support themselves in a life that they ordinarily would like to lead. And then we work backwards from there. How do you make sure to balance that with everything else?
Yeah. And would you say, because when you made that comparison with the European system, how would you say they incorporate some sort of actual joy in the, because that you said that was one of the bigger
Well, I
differences.
don't know about joy, about life, living life. So
Mm.
that, for example, a lot of what they use as texts to read are things like how to go shopping for groceries.
Oh, got it.
In other words,
Okay.
how do you read an ad in the newspaper that's
Got
advertising
it.
something?
It's
And
much more directly like what are the things you do on a daily basis that can be improved by literacy? Yeah.
right, and though that will actually, I believe, truly contribute to the joy of being able to read.
Yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, that is super interesting. We don't, and people say that about math too. I mean, where we could learn how to, pay taxes and but things that you can connect to math as well, but aren't done. Do you have a hypothesis for why we seem to avoid some of the more direct applications of these things?
Um, well, part of it's mechanical. It's that if you use real life examples, you are privileging certain kinds of backgrounds. In other words, if you've done that, I believe that you should have as a child, you should be exposed to what I call a literate, rich environment. And that means you should have lots of books, lots of newspapers, lots of discussions with your family. Um, and I'll even make a stronger suggestion. Research suggests mealtime discussions are important. And I know I can always get pushback when I say that. Well, we can't all be at the same place. Well, that is true. That's one of the problems. But I remember, almost every night sitting down with my family and then having that excruciating experience of saying, "What did you do today?" And not only did you have to say what you did, but you had to make sure that you had done something to talk about. So that's part of it. I think we don't pay attention to all of those things as we used to. And that sounds like I'm looking backwards again, but I'm not really. I think there's a lot of stuff that we have today that is far better for learning. We didn't talk about technology because I don't think there are a lot of good examples of software that actually teach reading independently without any other input. That almost all the research that I know of suggests that technology in limited quantities, for instruction is helpful, but not for entire instruction.
I mean, I think this was a really, really thank you for all your time because I feel like this was our first conversation on the show really about standards. And it's something I've been wanting to get into, but I feel like just this conversation made me realize how important it is for have like an entire season to really get into every single subject, have a few episodes just focused on literacy, on reading and writing, and then just on mathematics and just on physics and chemistry to really understand. Because I think at the most philosophical level, it is the people who think deeply about standards who have to think about what is the essence of this field that we wish to continue forward. And I think that's a really important question to always keep in the back of our mind.
Absolutely. There are many aspects of an older literacy curriculum that are no longer appropriate today. And writing,
Mm,
if you go back and look at things in writing, is a good example of it. I more recently worked on standards for Vietnam, and so I was immersed in the Vietnamese education system. The problem is that they didn't do anything about video or computers or anything else. They didn't teach students that way. They didn't teach them about it, and suddenly now they are doing it in the revision that we came up with. So I think we need to do that as well here. What parts of this could we do away with and what parts not? So, a lot of, for example, in some math curriculum that I've seen, we go in and the examples are, here's a train schedule. Well, how many people look at a train schedule to go buy a ticket for the train or, whatever it is? So it's a different kind of way of approaching it, that if you're going to do that, let's do it online and have maybe a simulated timetable. And how would you find the right time to go?
mm.
In other words, see, that's again a purpose thing. I think that's true for all of this stuff, is that we do this more in reading, is project-based stuff. But I think no matter what you teach. But I need to make one real quick point if we're running close to the time limit here. And that is that there are a lot of silos in education. So biology teachers don't want to know about reading because that's not part of their field. History teachers don't necessarily want to know about reading because that's not part of their field.
Hmm.
And so we don't teach students how to read biology, how to read history. Two different ways of approaching it. And yet,
And you're privileged you're privileging evidence is super important in this because it's like reading isn't just about, seeing evidence doesn't just come in one form. It's always at the intersection of two because you have to like you said, you have to read biology, you have to read data, you have to, you can't just yeah, you have to mix
let
them.
me add the overriding consideration is purpose.
Yeah.
You read those with different purposes in mind
Yeah.
and with different standards of evidence.
Hmm.
In history, you're really talking in history, past history, you're really talking about probabilities of things more than anything else. Well, we found evidence of this, and that sort of suggests that this is what was going on at the time. That we don't ever have that. Well, we very rarely, let me say that, we very rarely have conclusive evidence about decisions that were made and actions that were taken and reasons for them.
You just give me an idea. What if you were talking about these silos? What if there was a way where, whatever, I'm just throwing some random thing out, like once a week or once a month, you have two classes that someone normally takes, but the teachers come together and then they teach the intersection of those two. So you have English and math come together, and then you teach a class where it's the intersection of those two fields, where then you're forced to actually see how they're all interconnected and they're not actually silos.
I think you've got a great idea, but why stop at two?
Hmm.
In other words, this ought to be, my ideal here would be to have people reading authentic texts about authentic problems that meet their reading level. So if a first grader is going to have different concerns than a student who's graduating in high school, 12th grader. But I think you're onto something there that is really important. There's just a lot of inertia because of the economics, the policy, and the overwhelming thought that almost everybody who's been to school thinks they know how to do school. And they missed all the little nuances that the teacher went through to get them to reach the goal that she or he had set.
Hmm. Dang. This was an amazing conversation. I took so many notes. I feel like I'm excited to look over these and to really sit with this conversation. But thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, it's very stimulating. It made me think about a whole bunch of things that I hadn't thought about in a while, just because they become part of the background. And so that's one of the things that I always say. It's a great experience when I learn something from this kind of experience.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, this was just so helpful. And I want to say to all of you listening, thank you so much, because I hope you enjoyed it. And I think really covering standards, and I'm excited to do that for an entire season, just focused on those, will really help us kind of understand structurally how we're thinking about English and science and math. And so I hope you enjoyed. And as per usual, stay re-educated.